I thought it would be an ordinary afternoon in my garden, the kind where nothing memorable happens. Then my neighbor stopped me between the roses and the fence, looked at me with a seriousness I had never seen before, and said he needed to tell me something he had carried for years. What followed changed the way I see quiet moments, familiar faces, and even myself. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Which city or town are you listening in from? And if stories like this speak to you, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. It truly helps more than you know, and I'm grateful you're here. Now let me tell you what happened. I'm a woman in my early 50s, and I've learned that life doesn't usually announce its turning points. They arrive disguised as ordinary moments. That afternoon, the sun sat low but warm, the kind of light that softens everything it touches. I was in my garden, my small patch of peace behind the house, trimming the edges and talking to myself the way I often do when no one's around. The garden had become my quiet companion after my children moved out and my days grew quieter. The soil under my gloves, the steady rhythm of tending to something living, it grounded me. I didn't hear him at first. I was focused on a stubborn weed near the fence when a shadow crossed over the beds. "Hey," he said gently, like he didn't want to startle me. I looked up and saw my neighbor, Tom. We'd lived next to each other for nearly 8 years. Friendly waves, brief chats about the weather, the usual neighborly rhythm. He was around my age, maybe a little older, with a calm presence that always made him seem unhurried. "Hi, Tom," I replied, pulling off my gloves. "Everything okay?" He nodded, but his eyes told a different story. There was something careful in his posture, as if he had rehearsed this moment and still wasn't sure how it would go. "I was hoping to catch you," he said. "Do you have a minute?" I did. I always did, but something in his voice made that minute feel heavier than usual. I leaned back against the fence, the wooden slats warm against my shoulder. "Sure," I said. "What's on your mind?" He glanced toward his house, then back at me, and let out a slow breath. I've been meaning to say something for a long time, and I realized if I didn't say it today, I might never say it at all. That got my attention. My garden suddenly felt very quiet. Even the birds seemed to pause. "Okay," I said softly. "You can talk to me." We stood there, 2 neighbors separated by a line of flowers and years of polite distance. I noticed details I'd never paid attention to before. The faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his hands rested calmly at his sides, the sincerity in his expression. "I've watched you take care of this place," he began. "Not just the garden. Your home. Yourself. After everything you've been through." I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He smiled, just a little. "Small towns, quiet streets. We notice more than we admit. I know you lost your husband years back. I know you raised your kids mostly on your own after that. And I know you kept going." His words landed gently but deeply. I hadn't expected to feel seen like that, especially not by someone I'd only known in passing. "I don't mean to pry," he continued quickly. I wanted you to know that your strength hasn't gone unnoticed." I swallowed, feeling an unexpected tightness in my throat. "Thank you," I said. "That's kind of you." He nodded, but he wasn't finished. "There's more, and this is the part I've been nervous about." I waited, the air between us charged with something unspoken. My garden, my safe place, suddenly felt like the setting for something important. "Over the years," he said slowly, "our short conversations, the way you smile, the way you listen, they've meant more to me than you probably realize. Not in a way that crosses any lines, just in a human way, a reminder that connection doesn't disappear with age. I felt my shoulders relax. There was no pressure in his words, only honesty. And the honesty stirred something inside me I hadn't felt in a long time, the realization that I was still part of the world in a meaningful way. "I'm glad you told me," I said, and I meant it. We stood there a moment longer, the sun dipping lower, the garden holding our shared silence. I didn't know then that this conversation was only the beginning, that it would lead me to reflect on my own heart, my fears, and the quiet hopes I had tucked away. But as he thanked me for listening and stepped back toward his yard, I sensed that something subtle yet important had shifted. Sometimes all it takes is someone stopping you in the garden, asking for a moment, and choosing to speak from the heart. After Tom went back to his side of the fence, I stayed where I was, my gloves still dangling from my fingers. The light had shifted, turning the leaves a deeper green, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. When I finally exhaled, it felt like letting go of something I hadn't known I was carrying. That evening, I couldn't settle into my usual routines. I warmed up leftovers, turned on the television, then turned it off again. My mind kept drifting back to the way he'd looked at me, not with expectation, but with a kind of steady respect. It stirred memories of a version of myself I hadn't visited in years, the woman who used to believe her presence mattered simply because she was there. The next morning, I returned to the garden early, coffee mug in hand. The air was cool, and the earth smelled rich from watering the night before. Gardening had always been my way of thinking without forcing answers. As I trimmed and straightened, I replayed his words, not searching for hidden meaning, just letting them sit. Around mid-morning, I heard the familiar creak of the side gate. I didn't look up right away. I wanted to finish what I was doing, and maybe I needed a moment to steady myself. "Morning," Tom said, his voice carrying easily across the fence. "Morning," I replied, finally turning to face him. He looked relieved, as if he'd been worried I might avoid him. "I hope I didn't make things uncomfortable yesterday," he said. "That wasn't my intention." I shook my head. "You didn't. You surprised me, that's all. In a good way." He smiled, and for the first time I noticed how genuine it was, not rushed or uncertain. "I'm glad." I debated for a long time whether to say anything at all. "What made you decide to?" I asked. He leaned against the fence, mirroring my posture from the day before. I'd reached a point where silence felt heavier than honesty, and I figured, whatever came of it, at least I'd spoken truthfully. That resonated with me more than I expected. After my husband passed, I'd learned how easy it was to fall into quiet, to let days pass without sharing much of myself. It had felt safe, but also small. We talked then, really talked. About the neighborhood, how it had changed, how quieter streets sometimes made you hear your own thoughts more clearly. He told me about his retirement, how he'd struggled at first with the sudden openness of time. I shared how the house had felt too big after my children left, every room echoing with old routines. There was no rush in our conversation, no sense that we were moving towards something we hadn't agreed on. It felt like two people meeting each other honestly where they were. At one point, he said, "I think people our age forget we're still learning, still becoming." I laughed softly. "I forget that all the time." He looked at me thoughtfully. "You shouldn't. There's a lot of life left in you." That sentence stayed with me long after he returned to his yard. I found myself standing a little straighter that day, noticing the warmth of the sun on my arms, the comfort of my own skin. It wasn't about him, not exactly. It was about what his words had awakened in me. Over the next few days, our interactions became more natural. We'd pause to talk while taking out the trash or walking to the mailbox. Each conversation added another layer of ease. I learned he loved old jazz records, that he cooked better than he let on, that he missed having someone to share small observations with. One afternoon, as we stood by the fence again, he said, "I don't want to assume anything. I just want to say I enjoy these moments, and I respect whatever boundaries you need." I appreciated that more than I could express. "I enjoy them too," I said, "and I appreciate you saying that." As he nodded and smiled, I realized something important. This wasn't about filling a void or rewriting the past. It was about allowing space for connection without fear. For the first time in a long while, I felt open to whatever came next, not because I needed it, but because I was ready to accept it. That evening, as I watered the garden and watched the sky fade into softer colors, I felt a quiet sense of gratitude, not for answers, but for the courage to ask new questions. And somewhere beyond the fence, I sensed that Tom felt it too. The days that followed settled into a gentle rhythm, the kind you don't notice right away because it feels so natural. Our conversations didn't happen every day, and that was part of what made them special. There was no pressure, no expectation, just an understanding that when we did speak, it mattered. One afternoon, I was sorting through old boxes in the garage, the kind I'd been avoiding for years. Inside were reminders of earlier chapters of my life, children's school projects, photo albums, letters written in a handwriting I knew by heart. I sat on the concrete floor longer than I meant to, letting memories come and go without pushing them away. Later that day, I saw Tom out front, carefully washing his car. I almost waved and went back inside. Almost. Instead, I walked over, the gravel crunching under my shoes. "You look busy," I said. He turned off the hose and smiled. "Busy is relative. Mostly I'm just trying to feel useful." I laughed. I know that feeling. We ended up sitting on the low stone wall between our houses, the late afternoon breeze carrying the smell of cut grass. I told him about the boxes, about how strange it felt to touch pieces of my past without feeling overwhelmed by them. "That sounds like progress," he said. "It feels like it," I admitted. For a long time, I thought moving forward meant forgetting. Now I'm realizing it might just mean remembering differently. He nodded, thoughtful. "I think that's true. We don't stop being who we were. We just add to it." There was a pause then, comfortable and unhurried. I noticed how easy it was to be quiet together. That alone felt like a gift. He cleared his throat gently. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What do you want now?" he asked. "Not from anyone else, just for yourself." The question caught me off guard. I stared out at the street, at the familiar houses and trees I'd passed every day without really seeing. "I want to feel awake," I said finally. "Not in a dramatic way, just present. I want to trust that it's okay to care again." He smiled softly. "That sounds reasonable and brave." His words stayed with me that night as I lay in bed, listening to the quiet of the house. I realized how much of my energy I'd spent managing expectations, both my own and those of others. Somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten that it was allowed to want things simply because they mattered to me. A few days later, Tom knocked on my door for the first time. I remember noticing how unusual that felt, seeing him in that context instead of across the fence. "I was going for a walk," he said. "Thought I'd see if you'd like to join me. No worries if not." I hesitated only a moment before grabbing my jacket. "I'd like that." We walked slowly through the neighborhood, past houses that held stories we'd never know. He pointed out small details I'd never noticed: an old oak tree, a bench tucked away in a corner park. The conversation flowed easily, shifting from light observations to deeper reflections without effort. At one point he said, "I'm glad we didn't rush anything. It makes this feel real." I agreed. It feels honest. As we turned back toward home, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. Not excitement exactly, but something steadier. A trust in the moment, in myself, and in the quiet understanding forming between us. When we reached my house, we paused at the walkway. "Thank you for walking with me," he said. "Thank you for asking," I replied. As I watched him head back toward his place, I understood that this connection wasn't about changing my life overnight. It was about opening a door I'd kept closed for too long. And for the first time in years, that felt not just possible, but right. In the weeks that followed, something inside me settled into place. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did. Life continued much as it always had, yet it felt different now, as if someone had adjusted the focus and everything appeared clearer. Tom and I fell into a pattern that didn't need naming. Sometimes we talked by the fence, sometimes we didn't see each other for days. There was comfort in that. I noticed I no longer